so that we have this on the record. Good evening, everybody. I'm Sandy Borden, the director of the Ethics Center at Western Michigan University, and it is my pleasure to welcome you tonight to Disputed Memorials, the Moral Standards Question. Before we get going, though, I'd like to do a little housekeeping so you know how to participate in today's event. At any time during the program, you'll have the chance to submit your questions to the chat, so you don't have to wait till the end to put your questions in there. Go ahead and jump in. Our intern, Kara Walters, will be keeping track of your questions. And as time allows, then at the end of our conversation, we will get to those questions, as many as we can, before the end of the program. And as I mentioned, I did press record. We are recording this event. So those of you who are registered and are here today, you will definitely get a link if you'd like to watch that and share that afterwards. Western students, if you're attending this event for signature credit, Kara will be putting a link into the chat for you to record your attendance. So keep an eye out for that. And there will also be resources in the chat about Dr. Carey's book and about the Ethics Center, including our last two programs this semester with acclaimed author Amitav Ghosh on April 12. So make sure to look for information in the chat about that as well. And finally, I would like to make sure to thank our co-sponsor, Western's Office of Diversity and Inclusion. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ainsley Carey. Dr. Carey is Vice President for Students at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada, and a higher education consultant. He earned a master's degree in counseling and a doctorate in higher education administration from the University of Florida. He also earned master's degrees in business administration and the study of law from Auburn University and the University of Southern California, respectively. In 2009, he accepted his first vice presidency at Auburn University and held a similar position at the University of Southern California. And again, he is now at University of British Columbia. He joined that institution in 2019. In his latest book, Washington Next, Disputed Monuments, Honorees, and Symbols on Campus, Dr. Carey analyzes 25 university responses to memorial disputes, and that will be, of course, the basis of our conversation. So, Ainsley, welcome. Thanks for joining us tonight.
No, Sandy, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I always like to start these conversations with just kind of asking our guests, like, how did you get into this anyway? Like, how did you get interested in studying disputed memorials on college campuses and decide to write a book about it?
Sandy, first, let me say thank you for hosting this conversation, and thank you to WMU for hosting these critical conversations around matters of ethics, because I believe this is kind of the core of what our students and the next generation of leaders need to be thinking about, right? These are very difficult issues. I'd also like to thank our shared colleague, Dr. Glenda Rawls, one of your associate professors there. She was instrumental in making this happen. She was one of the first readers of the book, and since then she's passed it on to so many others, and since then I've had so many conversations. So you've already done my biography, and now let me dive into some of why this topic has been so interesting to me. As you mentioned, I've been a vice president for student affairs at 3 universities, Auburn, USC, and now the University of British Columbia. And in my role as vice president for students, I often work with students who are concerned about different things on campus. And in 2015, there were a number of national calls for universities to step up their game with regard to issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion. You might remember this story from 2015. So founded in 1816, Mother Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church is one of the oldest churches in the South. In South Carolina, it is the heartbeat of the Charleston community. Many Black political leaders come from this church, and they lead in the state of South Carolina, and they lead nationally. Well, in June of 2015, a 21-year-old white male entered the predominantly Black church just in time for a midweek Bible study. It was a steamy, hot night, and the young man entered the church, and the first thing that he asked for was to meet the pastor. And he had a chance to meet Reverend Clemente Pinckney. And Reverend Pinckney brought him to his side and allowed the young man to sit in on the weeknight Bible study. And the young man sat there patiently through an hour-long Bible study. And as parishioners stood to raise their heads in final prayer and bowed their heads, the young man revealed exactly why he was there. He pulled out a Glock 45 millimeter handgun and began shooting at the parishioners. Eventually, he killed 9 of the 12 parishioners in attendance at Mother Emanuel. And he said he was there to kill as many Black people as possible. He left the church as calmly as he entered, and the following day, he was discovered and arrested. Soon after, they learned that the young man worshiped the Confederate flag and Confederate memorials, and he was intending to spark a race war with his actions. Within weeks after this behavior, the South Carolina lawmakers broke a 4-decade-long stalemate about the appropriate memorialization of the Confederate flag. For decades, the Confederate flag in South Carolina flew on the State House dome and many other places throughout the state. But the lawmakers decided that they would remove the Confederate flag from the State House dome in 2015. Well, soon thereafter, 2 years later, we had riots in Charlottesville over a protest to remove the statue of Robert E. Lee. A young man then drove his car at full speed into a crowd of counter-protesters, killing 1 woman and injuring 19 others. But 3 years later, a Minneapolis police officer stood on the neck of George Floyd, killing him while an audience begged for his life. Soon thereafter, corporations, universities, athletic teams revisited all of their memorialization and all of their branding to find areas that may have been offensive to others, but also created a rallying point for violent white supremacy. And universities on our campuses revisited all of their memorials. I wanted to understand, as a student affairs administrator and a higher ed practitioner, how universities were making these very difficult decisions. So in 2015, from 2015 to 2020, several universities had responded to these disputes, and they put their responses in written reports that were online. And that is the focus of my analysis, 25 universities that responded to disputed memorials. And my primary interest, how do we guide universities in a very complex decision?
Yeah, thank you for reviewing that history, because it's important to remember this is happening within a particular historical moment. So, one of the things that I think comes up sometimes is, what is a memorial anyway, right? Compared to a monument, you hear both terms. And so I guess I wondered, how you define memorial, and why do you think memorials do evoke such strong emotions, like the ones you described?
Yeah, so thanks for adding that caveat. So you're right, memorials and monuments are often, the terms are used often interchangeably. I decided in order to provide clarity in the text, I wanted to make one definitive statement about memorials. In this sense, I'm using memorials as the umbrella term to recognize symbols, traditions, monuments, murals, portraits, and landmarks. Memorials are essentially anything that attempts to memorialize someone or something or a period of time and commemorate that thing, celebrate what's going on. But typically, people think memorials are statues, when in fact, a building's name is an act of commemoration. It's an act of claiming a space to remember someone, to create memory. And it also tells a story. It tells a story about the values of those who made the decision. It tells a story of the values of those who visit that space. So in this case, memorials included both monuments, statues, even a tradition could be a memorial. Portraits are memorials, and landmarks. And if your campus is older than 100 years old, chances are you have several hundreds of memorials around campus, building names, street names, signs, statues, things carved into buildings that represent an era prior to the current generation. So memorials, in the broadest sense, represented all of those things.
So I like that. I like that explanation, right? So it's commemoration, that's things and people we don't want to forget. And is the implication always that therefore we're honoring or paying tribute to those events or people? Is that part of what makes those controversial?
Yeah, so part of it, what makes it controversial is not just honoring, but it's the reason or the purpose that that memorial was established. So later on, we'll dive into issues of Confederate leaders or Ku Klux Klan leaders. Many of those were memorialized, or their names ended up on buildings, not as accidents, but in an effort to say, thank you for your good work as a segregationist. Thank you for your good work of leading the Confederate Army to defend slavery in the United States. So in memorials, we have to get back to the why. Why was it established? And many of the Confederate memorials were established to tell a different story of the Civil War, and it's part of the lost cause mythology. So I think the major question for me about memorials is the why question. So not all memorials are bad. Some memorials are connected to a history that's actually creating a new history or retelling and recasting a story from one perspective.
Great. So it's not just things or people we don't want to forget, but sometimes that we want to recast, maybe, right? In a whole different story, a whole different light. And so if I'm hearing you correctly, I do remember from the book some of the things that you mentioned, right? Segregationists and proponents of eugenics and KKK members, right? That these are often reasons why memorials are disputed. Am I hearing you say that part of the reasoning that you're interested in thinking about is that those kinds of associations are not incidental, but in fact, the actual very reason why they're being memorialized? Okay.
Yeah, well, thanks for
Okay.
getting to the nitty-gritty of this, right? So I examined, as you mentioned, 25 universities, and those 25 universities had about 56 memorials. And when you line all the memorials up, what students were protesting include the following categories, as you've referenced: those who were involved in colonization, those who came to the United States, repossess or dispossess indigenous people of their land, move them out of their territories and took over the land, colonizers. Those who owned enslaved people were part of students' concerns and disputes. Those who were segregationists, staunch segregationists, fought against people of color enrolling in institutions of higher education. Those who were actively involved in leading the eugenics movement, not someone just who believed in eugenics, but they were university presidents who were actively involved in the eugenics movement by promoting it as a science. And I had to learn a little bit more about eugenics. Eugenics was this essential belief about purity of a race, essentially saying some races are unfit to continue to have children, to reproduce in this country. Therefore, those groups or communities should be sterilized. Therefore, the purest race can continue to reproduce. So eugenicists were very much involved in this notion or this movement about creating cultural purity or racial purity. And those who were they deemed unfit could be forcefully sterilized by the state. So a state judge had the authority and the power to say this person shouldn't have any more children. And that was legalized in the United States until the early 1970s. Some of the memorials involved individuals who were involved in lynching and massacres and bragged about it. And these lynching and massacres were done for sometimes very minor racial slights, but they were most popular as an effort to suppress votes. If an individual or community was voting at the time Republican, then the Southern Democratic Party would go into that community, lynch several individuals, massacre several individuals, and that town wouldn't vote again. So lynching and massacres were a tool to suppress votes. And many of them that were memorialized were Confederate leaders and members of the Ku Klux Klan. So back to the heart of the question, right? When we think about memorialization, one of the most important questions is why was this memorialized? And these memorials weren't built in 1865 at the end of the Civil War. Many of them were built decades later into the early 1900s, not as a memorialization to the Civil War, but for what they did to keep the country segregated. They wanted to continue to promote this notion of subjugation of people of color. Therefore, in the South and across the United States, there are more than 2,000 Confederate memorials throughout the US. And it was part of an effort to subjugate individuals, but it was also part of an effort when schools began to integrate in the 1950s after Brown versus Board of Education. Many Southerners were concerned about students of color entering those universities. So a number of universities introduced Confederate memorials and building names into their landscapes.
So thank you for that. So I wonder if at this point it might be helpful to discuss a specific example. I mean, is there something that, I mean, maybe one that kind of crystallizes some of this history that you're telling us about?
Yeah, so let me take the example of Middle Tennessee State University. Middle Tennessee State University, their Army ROTC building is named after Nathan Bedford Forrest. Nathan Bedford Forrest was a plantation owner, slave owner in the mid 1800s and the 1850s. When the Civil War broke out, he joined the Confederate Army. And Nathan Bedford Forrest grew up in the ranks of the Confederate Army during the 4-Year War, and he was known as a brutal general. One of his most famous acts is the battle at Fort Pillow, where a small garrison of Black troops surrendered to the Confederate Army. Typically in war, the force that surrenders is taken into prison. In this case, Nathan Bedford Forrest ordered the men to be executed. So the garrison of Black soldiers were all executed. When the war was finished, Bedford Forrest returned in Tennessee to continue his work as a plantation owner. And when the war was over, the 13th Amendment passed, and therefore slavery was abolished. It was abolished legally. However, there was a system of convict labor that continued where Black men and young Black boys could be arrested for random crimes. And as a result, they would continue to serve in another form of slavery, which was convict leasing. They would be sold out. And Nathan Bedford Forrest used his plantations to continue the perpetuation of convict leasing. In 1865, the Ku Klux Klan was born, and Nathan Bedford Forrest was the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. Well, in 1958, Nathan Bedford Forrest's name was added to the Army ROTC building at Middle Tennessee State University. You may recall in 1954, the Supreme Court passed Brown versus Board of Education. In response, many Southern states found ways to continue segregation, and one of the ways was to add memorials on campus to communicate to students that this isn't a welcoming environment. So Bedford Forrest's name was added 70 years after his death, was added to the Army ROTC building in Middle Tennessee State University. Students in 2015 gathered up their concerns and protested. Eventually, a task force was formed by the university's president, and that task force agreed that this name should be removed from the building. The task force took their concerns to the university's board of governors. That board also agreed that this name should be removed. However, in Tennessee, they have what's called the Tennessee Heritage Protection Act. Heritage Protection Acts, which are in 8 former Confederate states, focus on protecting Confederate memorials. So the Tennessee Historical Society must pass with a 2/3 vote the university's request to remove Nathan Bedford Forrest, and it did not pass the Tennessee Historical Society. So today, Nathan Bedford Forrest, a former Confederate soldier and first leader of the Ku Klux Klan, remains memorialized at Middle Tennessee State University.
Wow, that is, I did not know about the heritage laws. That's incredible. Thank you. That actually clarifies a lot. So part of how you contextualize these disputes is with the concept of landscape fairness. Do you want to explain that? Like, what is that?
Yeah, so one of the most important findings in the work in examining 25 universities and 56 disputed memorials, what I did was read every university's response, and eventually code every university's response to identify the themes and patterns that were throughout. There were four major themes that appeared throughout, but no single university activated all four of these themes. But there were four major frameworks or mindsets or questions that universities must interrogate in order to make these very complex decisions. One framework is what I'll call the principal legacy framework. What was the honoree's complete legacy? Often we dispute an honoree based on a single component of their life, like to say, okay, this individual owned slaves, so let's remove them from campus. Okay, this individual was a segregationist, so let's remove them from campus. In the principal legacy framework, it's important to examine the individual's entire legacy. All of the pluses, all of the minuses, everything that the individual contributed to society or maybe even took away from society, all of the harms, but also all of the goods. So how do we examine and get to the core of an individual's principal legacy? And we all could imagine personally, we've done some things in our lives that we're not completely proud of, maybe while we were younger or we made mistakes. So a principal legacy examination is a holistic review of an individual. So that's one framework. The second framework is what I'll call preservation. And I mentioned it in the Middle Tennessee State University, is this notion of what do we preserve? What's important enough in our society at our universities that we should protect? That is part of our story, is how we were born. It's why we were here. Some of those things should be worthy of preserving. The question I would ask is where to preserve it, right? Sometimes, is it the residence hall that we'll preserve it, or a 30-foot statue in the middle of campus? But where we preserve it is a separate question. But the main question is, what should be preserved? And Heritage Protection Acts are intended to preserve our history, the country's history. And they're not unusual. Throughout the United States, many things, many acts preserve land, sea, ocean, monuments. Different types of animals are protected by preservation acts, shipwrecks, artwork, film. We have several acts that protect things that we deem important to society, and everyone should learn about it. So a university, when they're faced with a memorial dispute, have to interrogate this notion of what is important for us to preserve as a university, as Western Michigan University. What's important to us? What's a unique part of our story? And how do we preserve it? Where is a separate question. The third framework is the one that you've mentioned, landscape fairness. As we invite, as universities, we invite students, faculty, staff, community members from all over the world. We ask them to come to our campus to live, to learn, to eat, to participate in our academic enterprise. As we invite this diversity from around the world, is our academic space fair to everyone? Imagine inviting students of different ethnic backgrounds to come to your campus and then housing them in a residence hall named after a Confederate leader or a leader of the Ku Klux Klan. Students will realize this. This will become of awareness to your campus community. And you created a residence hall that you said, we want to create community. Now live in Robert E. Lee Residence Hall, or live in Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, live in a residence hall named after him. So landscape fairness forces us to interrogate our memorials communicate values to our community. Is this fair that we're asking students to live under these conditions? And one of the last points that we'll discuss later on tonight is the question of the moral standards. Which moral standards should we use? The moral standards of 1850 or the moral standards of 2020? And there's a considerable debate on both sides of the moral standards question. But landscape fairness is an important discussion that we should have that gets at the heart of, is this fair to ask students to live under these conditions? I'll use an example that I often hesitate to use because it is so abhorrent, and we would all agree that this is abhorrent. But would we ever bring students to campus and name a residence hall after a Nazi leader, or display the Confederate flag in any building on, not the Confederate flag, but the Nazi flag in any building on campus, or a swastika on campus? We would never display that. It would never be seen as acceptable. Yet we ask Black students to come to universities while we continue to promote Confederate soldiers and segregationists.
Yeah, I just think that's an excellent point. I think at one point I think in the book you talk about students of color having to pass through like a gauntlet. Oh, you actually use the word gauntlet, right, of statues and other kinds of memorials of this kind, right, that are just so deeply hurtful and offensive. And it seems to me that college campuses are supposed to provide, right, a welcoming space, right, a safe space where everybody can learn together and um, discover new things about themselves. How do you ask a student to do that
Yeah.
when when they're faced with these kinds of
Let me give you another
restrictions?
example in that category. In the book, I tell a story about the University of Texas. The University of Texas had a main corridor on campus that had 6 statues lining that corridor. 4 of those statues were of Confederate leaders. Um, Robert E. Lee, the leader of the Confederate Army, Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederate Army, and 2 other generals in the Confederate Army. And since the 1930s, students walked through this corridor on their way to class every single day, seeing these memorials. Well, in 2004, in 2009, in 2015, protest continues.
Mhm.
Task force gathered together to decide what to do. But in 2017, after the Charlottesville riots that were involved in removing a memorial of Robert E. Lee, the university's president at Tennessee decided it was time to remove the Confederate statues from the University of Tennessee. Nicholas State University, which has a paragraph in the book, in 1962, when Nicholas State University was forced to integrate after refusing to integrate since 1954, the student government got together and decided that they would name every street on campus after a plantation or a plantation owner at Nicholas State University. Today, those street names remain. And those street names weren't added to honor the great plantation owners of the state. They were added to subjugate the students of color who they felt were being forced to join their universities.
That is just so spiteful. Wow. Okay, thank you. Another great example. Not the kind that we want to hear about, but again, very helpful to understand the problem. So yeah, let's get into the moral standards question because it seems to me that's often a key part of these disputes, right? That when people protest a memorial, right, the other side will often be like, well, you shouldn't judge them on today's standards, right? We should judge them on whatever, was current at the time. And you called that kind of argument historical relativism. So maybe you can explain that a little.
Yeah, so one of the things that we've seen, as you've already pointed out, they will take issues like segregation or slave ownership and say, look, in the 1800s, slave ownership was common. The truth is, it wasn't all that common. The rest of the civilized world had abandoned slavery in the early 1800s,
Mhm.
1807, 1808. The United States kept it going, and only really about 1/3 of land owning white men in the South were the most dominant in terms of slave ownership. But the general argument is it wasn't against the law. This wasn't a crime
Mhm.
at the time. So, how do we look back into history 100 plus years ago and say that behavior that Robert E. Lee was doing or George Washington did because he owned more than 200 slaves, that behavior wasn't a crime at the time. It was
Mhm.
common. Others practiced it. It was open. Some indigenous people owned enslaved people. A small number of Africans or African Americans owned enslaved people. So why are we today judging a behavior that was okay 100 years ago? Are we going to go back 400 years, 500 years, 1,000 years and look at other behaviors and say, well, that behavior was wrong, so now we want to remove memorials to Caesar or remove memorials to any other historical figure? So those who make that argument make the historical relativism argument. They are making the argument that the behavior was appropriate at the time when the honoree was doing it. Therefore, today, we should not judge them as if they were committing a crime today. So historical relativism says, look at the memorials from the era that they were in, not today's standards.
So, as somebody who works in ethics, one of the things that I always point out to my students is, first of all, that law and ethics are not the same thing, right? So just because, it was legal doesn't mean it was okay then or now, right? But then we talk about relativism quite a lot as well. So, but before we kind of maybe get into that discussion, the other side of the debate that you discuss in the book, you call presentism. So maybe we can go ahead and talk about that and kind of see where that leaves us in terms of thinking about this moral standards question.
Yeah, so just on the opposite side of the coin of historical relativism is this question of presentism. So there is a group that's at the table, and it's typically this generation of students. So sometimes we call them millennials or Generation Z, but this generation of students, they're saying, no, that doesn't matter because it was commonly practiced, because segregation was allowable. It was still wrong then. And today, our standards say this behavior is wrong. It is wrong today to own an enslaved person or enslave people. It's wrong today to segregate our schools by race. Although it was practiced up until the mid 1950s, it's wrong today. So presentism, that position says the only thing that matters is right now. That's the only thing that matters. So let's not go backwards and suggest something was appropriate and something was legal or it was protected by law. The only thing that matters are the values of the community today. So as I've given you example, segregation, had an effect. Segregation was practiced up to the 1950s. Some universities have buildings on campus that are named after staunch segregationists. You may recall the Alabama governor who stand at the doorsteps of the University of Alabama in the early 1960s, after Brown versus Board of Education had been passed in the 1950s. And his quote that we can recall is, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. George Wallace's name is on several buildings throughout universities in the state of Alabama. He was an Alabama governor. Their position was segregation was permitted back then, but presentism, those who speak on those terms, say that behavior is inappropriate today. Therefore, we should not memorialize and continue to commemorate Governor Wallace today.
All right, so those are kind of like the two poles of this debate. But in the book, you end up saying you kind of want to go with a third approach, right? So I'm quoting you here. Historical figures are multidimensional, right? That's one quote. And another is issues involving their memorialization, if I can get that word out, are equally complex, right? So you're kind of arguing for complexity and maybe not just kind of oversimplifying by going to either extreme. So what do you have in mind?
Yeah, so we all, especially historical figures, have mixed legacies. Even ourselves. We have things about our lives that were complicated, things that we did when we were 15 that we're not proud of today, things that we did when we were 20 that we're not proud of in our 30s, 40s, or 50s. Some people did some things in their 40s that they're not proud of today in their 50s. So we all live in this world of mixed legacies. If we ever did the complete tally of our lives, boy, we would be covering our heads in some instances in shame, right? It was kind of like the old Christmas story when you past, present, and future version of you, where you realize some of the things that you've done now that you've grown up somewhere, you kind of say, oh, that was kind of tough. So we all have these mixed legacies, and historical figures are no different. Many politicians, sports figures, political leaders, US presidents, all have mixed legacies. What I am arguing for is that universities grapple with this. And I think that's such an important term that your colleague, Dr. Rawls, helped me come to terms with. But we should struggle with it. Instead of picking one side, just say, Well, history allowed it, so let's not touch it. It's appropriate for the past. Or today's values don't allow it, let's remove it. I'm saying
Mhm.
let's grapple with both ends of that pole. Let's do both analysis. Let's not pick one side of the coin and pretend that the other side of the coin doesn't exist. Universities are places where students, faculty, staff, scholars, we should struggle with these things. These are important learning opportunities. I believe there are voices on both sides of the coin that deserve to be discussed. I'm not suggesting which side of the coin is appropriate. What I'm suggesting is that universities grapple with both. And grapple is very intentional here, to say, let's leave no stone unturned because there are voices on both sides of the coin. One of the reasons why I stress so much the four frames and how we should do principal legacy analysis, landscape fairness, moral standards questions, all of the preservation. We should grapple with all of them because these are complex issues and voices get a chance to speak up when we grapple with all sides of the coin. When we only pick one side of the coin, we're only listening to one perspective of the story. And that's history's precise mistake, that history is told only from one perspective. It is right now is being told from the perspective of the Confederate soldier, the army that fought against the United States. They built 2,000 statues as if they won the war. Well, the Southern Historical Society, the Lost Cause documents recasted the Civil War in a way that makes the past look like something that we should honor. So, what I am saying is grapple with that past, but also grapple with our current decisions and bring both of those conversations together, um, honoring and respecting the complexity of these very difficult decisions. I'll give you one specific example and then open the floor for your next question. Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was the leader of the Confederate Army. He was trained as an American soldier at West Point. He fought in Union wars against indigenous people. He fought to help the country gain its independence and did lots of other work on behalf of the Union Army. When the Civil War broke out, he said he's going to side with his home state of Virginia and join the Confederacy. He eventually led the Confederate Army. At the end of the Civil War, he surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant. The Civil War ended, and he almost immediately stepped into the presidency of Washington and Lee University. Washington and Lee University is named after first President George Washington and Confederate leader Robert E. Lee. Both of their names name Washington and Lee University. At Duke University, Robert E. Lee has no connection, but Robert E. Lee's statue stood in the chapel at Duke. They removed it in 2017 after the Charlottesville riots. At the University of Texas, Robert E. Lee has no affiliation. They removed his statue in 2017 after the Charlottesville riots. Washington and Lee University, his name is embedded in the university. His tomb is at the university. Lee Chapel is at the university. Nearly 30 portraits of him are at Washington and Lee University. The president's house is named after Robert E. Lee. And up until 2020, the state of Virginia celebrated Jackson Lee Day instead of Martin Luther King Day. And that celebration, Jackson was a Confederate soldier, Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee. So two Confederate soldiers were celebrated up until, I believe, 2021 in the state of Virginia. So Washington and Lee University has a much more complicated decision to make about the memorialization of Robert E. Lee versus Duke and versus the University of Texas. So my strong suggestion is that we not simplify this. We not turn this into a single-sided coin. We actually flip over both sides of the coin and grapple with it, struggle with it. I'm not suggesting which side that we'll come out on, but I'm suggesting that these figures and our institutions are capable to struggle with these.
It's what we teach our students, right? We're supposed to be able to do this stuff. Yeah, and it doesn't mean it's not hard.
Hmm.
So I just can't resist as an ethics person to kind of draw some distinctions here in terms of the conversation. So law and the ethics, not the same thing. And I would also say social convention is not the same thing as ethics either, right? So just because it was considered okay back then or is considered okay today, that doesn't seem to me to be a proper measure either. Um, I think we can think a little more deeply, right? I mean, are there some basic kinds of values that we think are important, like not causing unnecessary harm that
Yeah.
could help us make these decisions, or respecting human dignity? There's a good one. We could work, it seems to me that there's some principles that we could probably grapple with, to use your word, that gets us closer to making these decisions, as opposed to kind of leaving it up to, well, let's take a poll, and today it's good and tomorrow it's bad.
Yeah.
I don't think it's quite, that it's not quite that simple, right? I mean, we have to really grapple. I think you're right.
Yeah.
And we have to, of course, take context into account, without a doubt. And I
Yes.
love how you're building context into the discussion with all these careful details. That's great.
Yeah.
And, related to that, I guess I would ask you, are there instances, and, you mentioned, for example, putting up a swastika on a college campus, right? I mean, are there instances like that when there just is not a good ethical alternative besides just removing the memorial, right? Because you mentioned different alternatives, maybe we can contextualize it, maybe we can do this, maybe we can do that. But so sometimes, is it just the only way to ethically deal with this kind of problem is to just remove the
Yeah.
memorial?
So I'll take this opportunity to talk about another finding in the book was how those 25 universities responded. As I mentioned, the 25 universities between them had about 56 memorials. Some universities had one or two, some universities had 6 memorials on their campus. As I mentioned, if your university is 100 plus years old, it's located in one of the former Confederate states, chances are you have several building names after Confederate leaders or Klan leaders on campus. So there were 56 memorials involved in these 25 universities. 22 of them were retained. The university said, we're not going to remove these. We're going to keep them. And this is after considerable institutional debate. Some of them were preserved by the state's Heritage Protection Act, and the university had no ability to remove them, no matter what the task force or committee decided. So 22 of them were retained. 25 of them were removed. The statue was removed, the building name was removed, the memorial or the flag. The University of Mississippi used to have the Confederate flag flown at athletic events. That was removed. They used to play the Confederate battle hymn, Dixie. That was removed. Their school mascot used to be a rebel. That was removed. So there was several, things that have been removed. So 25 were removed. Yet 8 of them were relocated. They moved them to another place on campus that they could be appropriately contextualized and removed away from the center of campus. So they became part of a museum, or they became part of a local cemetery where other Confederate soldiers may be buried. As I mentioned, the University of Mississippi had a 80-foot tall monument pedestal with a Confederate soldier atop it that was debated for several years. Recently, it was decided that the statue would be removed or relocated to a local cemetery where other Confederate soldiers were buried. The big concern there is that they're spending about $1.2 million to beautify the cemetery and the statue, making it somewhat of a shrine to the Confederacy. So that's been the response. But relocating the memorial is another opportunity, and putting it in a space that it can be appropriately contextualized. The University of Texas removed Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, and put that into a history museum on campus with the appropriate signage and plaques and contextualization next to other memorials. But let me speak some about contextualization in that it does have some problems to it. So contextualization, as they did at University of Texas and they did it at Kentucky with a mural, contextualization sometimes means adding a descriptive plaque next to the memorial or monument that individuals would come up and read and learn the history of why this building's name is here, or why this statue is here, or why this mural is here. And the hope is that once individuals read the history and learn the history, then they're going to say, oh, now I understand why it's appropriate to have Robert E. Lee on a horse at our university. Oh, now I understand why Nathan Bedford Forrest is here at Middle Tennessee State University. At least that's the hope, but it doesn't work. When institutions use contextualization as an effort to say, dear community, calm down, we're going to educate you. And then you will be less upset about this former governor that used lynching and massacres to suppress votes. Then you'll be less upset. That's not working. Within years, students will return to the site and say, this remains inappropriate. This plaque is not sufficient. The only thing that we're asking for is removal, right? So contextualization is problematic. But another response that we are also seeing that has some promise, that's being used by more progressive universities in this space, is what we're calling counter memorials, where in addition to removing an existing memorial or relocating an existing offensive memorial, the university will think about what other groups have made contributions to our university. Our university likely is on land of indigenous people. We should acknowledge that. Our university, chances are, was built by enslaved labor. We should acknowledge that. So some universities are honoring the first Black student to enroll, the first Black student to graduate, the first Black faculty members at the university, the first Heisman Trophy winner. So you will see some universities move toward this kind of counter memorial movement to say, let's adequately represent contributors to our university from multiple perspectives. This is an effort to tell the rest of the story, right? In addition to the fact that, segregationists may have founded Baylor University. Many of the founders and original trustees of Baylor University owned enslaved people and were sympathetic to the Confederate Army. Baylor decided, let's appropriately relocate those memorials, contextualize it, and at the same time, let's recognize the rest of the story of our university, which I think has been a great mix for that university to do that contextualization work. It doesn't always work. I'll give you the story of the University of Kentucky. University of Kentucky had a mural in the lobby of one of their main academic buildings. The mural was about 12 feet tall, 36 feet wide, up against the wall, and it was drawn in the 1940s. And the story of the mural is to tell the agrarian and agricultural and industrial story of the state of Kentucky. However, in that story also includes pictures of enslaved people singing and dancing, having a great time. It also showed pictures of indigenous people hunting in very stereotypical indigenous gear. And students of color and indigenous students were walking into that space in order to get to a classroom, and they were seeing this life-size mural every single day. For more than a decade, students had been complaining about this mural. After the death of George Floyd, the university revisited their decision to retain that memorial. That mural. And since then, the mural has been removed at the University of Kentucky. And they attempted to soften the mural by adding a counter memorial across the hall from it of Frederick Douglass. So they created a mural of Frederick Douglass, and students continued to protest. It was the death of George Floyd that triggered their complete reconsideration of this mural that fantasized about the fun of slavery and the stereotypes about indigenous people.
Yeah, I'm just struck by the resistance, even after it's pretty plain and well documented. I also, I really appreciate how you're kind of drawing in this idea of kind of bringing in other voices that were left out, right? Because I think a lot of times people complain that, oh, you're trying to erase history. Well, no, actually, we're trying to tell real history, which is right, factual, but also including all all the different perspectives, right? As opposed to just one kind of way of looking at things. I mean, that's what
It,
historians actually do. They don't just
yes.
try to come up with fantasies, right?
Right. In addition to, there are two major complaints with memorial disputes. One is this is a slippery slope. If you remove Robert E. Lee, is George Washington next, right? Is Thomas Jefferson next? Is James Madison next? So the title of the book, Washington Next, with a question mark, asks the question, would we ever, as a country or as a state or as universities or as municipalities, where George Washington's name is on probably every street
Mhm.
in every state, every other street, and several states have George Washington's name.
Mhm.
The state of Washington is named after Washington. Washington University is named after George Washington. Would we ever deliberate the memorialization of George Washington? It's almost hard to imagine right now, but there
Mhm.
will be a future generation that will say, wait a minute, this guy owned 150 slaves? Gosh, how do we feel about that today? And is it appropriate to memorialize him this way? So I think this is one of the future questions. This series of conversations is not over, and I'm not here to propose a solution to that, but I think grappling with this will continue for some time. There are several memorials, the most offensive ones, the most obvious ones, Confederate soldiers, Ku Klux
Mhm.
Klan leaders. Well, they're obvious to me. Um, but I think the
Mhm.
most obvious ones are on the surface right now. At some point, a future generation will go deeper into what we memorialize.
So yeah, that's good because I've been thinking, how does this all relate again to this historical moment, which is where we started, which is these larger conversations we're having about race and colonialism in this country right now. Another example that occurs to me is Christopher Columbus, right?
Yes.
Which around the Western world is memorialized in heroic terms, and in our country we have many places named after Columbus, including the District of Columbia. Um, so it raises similar questions, right? I mean, it's kind of like so deeply embedded
Mhm.
that I think those questions are starting to be asked. It'll be interesting to see where the conversation goes next.
You asked another good question that I really appreciate, and I appreciate it because I don't have a clear answer to it. You asked, are there no good ethical alternatives? I might challenge the notion that whether ethical alternatives are good or bad, right? I think the behavior of the individual we may judge as good or bad, but the ethical
Mm-hmm.
decision making, I look forward to your class, perhaps even educating me on this. How do we decide what was a good ethical decision, what was a bad ethical decision, right? So I don't know if the complexities of ethical decision making always make good and bad crystal clear. Because
Mm-hmm.
like the Washington and Lee University example, in Texas, they said he must be removed from University of Texas. But boy, Washington and Lee University is saying, gosh, this guy is embedded in the spirit of our
Right.
university. It'd be like Western Michigan University no longer being Western Michigan University.
Right.
And interesting, here in Canada, Ryerson University recently removed their name because their namesake was very involved in the residential school system, which is removing
Oh,
Indigenous
sure.
children from their
Mm-hmm.
families and taking
Mm-hmm.
them into schools. Ryerson was very involved, and they decided to completely remove his name from the university and completely rename the university.
Yeah, that's really interesting in terms of all the kind of the spectrum of alternatives. So one of the things I've been thinking about as I'm thinking about all the different alternatives that are available is, in states where they're just literally not allowed to remove things, right, because of these heritage laws. I mean, are they doing anything? I mean, are they trying to at least ameliorate the situation? I mean, I think I would be tempted to like cover them up or something.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, what can be done in those circumstances? Do you have any examples?
Yeah, so the state of South Carolina After the Confederate flag was removed from the State House dome in 2015, after the Charleston Church massacre, the state and many other Southern states strengthened their heritage protection acts to prevent the future thought of removing other Confederate memorials. So, Georgia recently did an assessment of 26 universities within the system of Georgia. They examined more than 700 plus buildings that were named after individuals or corporations. Nearly 80 of those buildings were associated with individuals who had strong ties to slave ownership or earned their revenue through slave ownership. They were members of the Confederacy or they were leaders in the Klan. And their names were placed on those buildings because of their leadership in those spaces. So the state of Georgia, after receiving that report, then said, okay, we're not going to do anything with this report because the state's Heritage Protection Act does not allow us to act on this. However, the individual universities may decide what you want to do. So individual universities do some of the things that we mentioned: contextualization, adding a descriptive plaque next to it, counter memorials, adding another memorial on campus in an effort to say to the community, yes, we do have a Confederate leader named on our building. However, we also want to recognize our first Black graduate or a Nobel Prize winner from our university. I'll give you an interesting example that was very recent within the past 2 months. The University of Alabama had Bibb Graves Hall. Bibb Graves was an Alabama governor. He was also a leader of the Ku Klux Klan in the state of Alabama. Bibb Graves Hall is a major academic building on the University of Alabama's campus. Students have been protesting it for years, especially with the heightened awareness following Charleston, Charlottesville, and George Floyd. So the committee's solution was, let's add to the name Graves Lucy, because Lucine Autry, Autry and Lucy rather, was the first Black graduate, was the first Black student, to attend the University of Alabama. She was suspended after 1 week of enrollment because the students rioted during her 1 week of enrollment at the university. So the university's president deemed that she was a hazard to public health, and she was suspended, removed from the university. So they decided, let's honor her and let's add her name to the building. So they named the building Graves Lucy Hall in an effort to say we want to recognize her, but we also want to retain the former Confederate, the former Klan leader on this building. That lasted about 7 days. The community erupted and the university reversed the decision. So there are ways that universities in the former Confederate states are dealing with this. There are about 8 states that have Heritage Protection Acts in place. You can petition your state legislature for an exemption to remove something. The University of South Carolina has a residence hall named after the father of gynecology, Sims. I can't remember his first name, but the women's residence hall is named after Sims. Those who know the history of gynecology know that Sims practiced his work on enslaved women. He practiced his procedure on enslaved women without any anesthesia. And he used several women, several of them died, many of them suffered excruciating pain while he practiced his methods of gynecology. Now, he invented great discoveries around different women's health efforts, but many enslaved women paid the costs. There's a great book called Medical Apartheid that examines his work and the brutality of his work and how enslaved people were used to create discoveries that we benefit from today. But the University of South Carolina is struggling to remove his name because the state protects it. He's not even a Confederate soldier. So I'm not sure how his name is being protected.
Yeah, how it's protected. Oh, wow.
But they're using the Heritage Protection Act to do so.
Yeah, that's an excellent book. The Ethics Center did a book club on that last year. Yeah,
Mhm.
so thank you so much. So I want to make sure that our attendees can get into this conversation. So just a reminder to all of you, please put your questions in the chat. I'd like to go ahead and turn to those questions, but before I do, Ainsley, is there anything else that that you'd like to say or to cover before we look at some questions?
I'd like to jump right to the questions. I want to make sure we
Okay,
have enough
great.
time for us to get pushed on this.
Great. So I have a question from my colleague, Sue Ellen Christian. She says, I'm wondering what advice the speaker has for us on college campuses on how we can ensure our campuses are free of historic names that honor racism. Is there a resource or a methodology to fact check the history of our names and places?
Mm. Now, I'm not aware of a resource that you can type in a name and then it tells
Hmm.
you enough about the individual to help you make that decision. But much of the history on these topics are not on these individuals are not mysterious, right? It's whether they be in the university's archival background. Usually, there's an archivist at your university that can tell you about every building name, every structure. Your
Okay,
university libraries are
right.
excellent resources for that. But I'm not aware of a source that you can turn to and just say Western Michigan University. It lists all the building names and then it tells you, it gives
Hmm.
you a score on each individual, which would be a brilliant resource for someone to invent. But I'm not aware of that resource. The thing that I advocated for in my work is that universities should have a process to do this. We have a process for naming buildings, right? So big donor comes forward, says, I have $50
Hmm.
million.
Hmm.
Thank you very much. Your name is now on the new science building. What we don't have a process for is how to remove that name when something
Right.
goes wrong, right? Like we don't know how to give the
Hmm.
donor the money back and remove the
Right.
name. And so universities struggle in this space. So there's really no
Yeah.
policy in this space. And many of the ownership of building names is not the president's, it's not the students, it's not the
Yeah.
vice
Yeah.
president for students, it's your board.
So
Your
bored,
board,
right? That's right.
it's
Hmm.
your board that
Uh-huh.
oversees that. So what I advocate for is that universities think through a process before you get there. Rather
Right.
than let's wait until it hits the fan, think through
Right.
if we have one of these, what's the composition of the committee? Which faculty members should we involve? Which policy
Mhm.
will guide our decision making? Let's look at other universities that have done this. And that's precisely what's happening in my book. It's an outline of 25
Mhm.
other
Mhm.
universities who've done this work, how they developed their policies, how many students were on the task force, the
Mm.
principles they considered, and the frameworks that they examined. And that's the focus of the work. One thing I have not seen, and I'll end on this point, I have yet to see a university proactively take this on. It
Yep.
has always been generated by student protests. And
Mhm.
then the faculty and staff joined the student protests.
Mhm.
Um, Even universities with names that everyone knows is inappropriate. Not one university has said, we have proactively examined these names and we have decided that we're going to change this. Absent a protest, none of them have done that.
Yeah, that's really great advice. So we do have good archives as part of a university, so we could probably do some research and
Mhm.
proactively ask these questions. That's great
And
advice.
I'd add another resource, that your history department. You actually have history
Absolutely. That's
professors
right.
and law
We have
professors.
historians. Yes, that's
You
right.
have historians
Exactly.
and you have
Exactly.
law professors who live in
Mhm.
this space, who write
Yeah,
on
yeah,
this space.
for
So I think
sure.
there's a lot of existing scholarship at universities that can completely guide this discourse.
Yeah, once again, we're in a uniquely good position to grapple with these kinds of
Hmm.
issues. We're made for this stuff, right?
That's right.
This is what we do.
Yes.
Candy McCorkle, who's our VP of the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, has a comment in the chat about eugenics, saying eugenics negatively impacted individuals with mental illness, LGBTQIA plus, and African Americans in the U.S. so far as reproductive rights. As I understand it, that history is not so far in the past, right?
More.
This is, yeah, this stuff actually, there's still some of this going on with
Yeah.
asylum seekers and immigrants.
Yep.
This is not, it's a live issue. Yeah.
more than 60,000 Americans were forcefully sterilized up until the 1970s. About 22 states had on the books forced sterilization laws, which allowed a judge to say, this young woman that's in prison, she's already had 2 kids and she shouldn't have any more. She's unfit, and she would be forcefully sterilized. One of the Supreme Court individuals in Buck versus Bell was a Supreme Court case that upheld states' rights to do forced sterilizations. A quote from, I believe it was Oliver Wendell Holmes, said, 3 imbeciles is enough. And he was referring to a young woman who had already had 2 children, and the state, I believe it was Indiana, decided to sterilize her without telling her. And years later, she discovered she couldn't have any more kids, and she took the case to court, and the Supreme Court upheld the state's ability to forcefully sterilize someone without telling them. And there's a book on this topic, I believe it's entitled 3 Imbeciles is Enough, and it focuses on that time period and the nation's harsh history around eugenics and forced sterilization. Just recently, I believe the state of California settled with 20,000 survivors of forced sterilization.
Exactly. So here's a question from my colleague Ashley Atkins in philosophy. How do the aesthetic dimensions of memorials bear on the questions that you're interested in? Memorials tell us what is worthy of honor, but they do so aesthetically, I assume. What difference does that make?
I'm trying something, when I'm in Washington, D.C., there are some, roundabouts, the big, when you have to drive around, and there's this beautiful memorial statue in the center with a water fountain going, and a person on a stallion, and the horse looks, you could just admire, wow, like just the imagery of it is at times impressive and overwhelming. But then when I think Monument Avenue in Virginia is an avenue that used to have a lot of Confederate monuments up and down, and people would visit. It was a tourist attraction to visit these enormous statues, and just to think about, man, someone carved that. Someone had the vision to create that, and then get it, just the work that it took to establish this and put it in place. Stone Mountain, Georgia is the largest Confederate memorial in the world. An entire granite mountain in Georgia is carved into it 3 Confederate soldiers, Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, and Nathan Bedford Forrest. So or P.T. Beauregard, rather. So there are some memorials that when you stand back and look at it, you are wowed in awe, right? So it's aesthetically beautiful. And now we're to the point where we're saying, but let's look closer at why this is here. What is it trying to honor? What messages is this communicating? And who hasn't had a chance to tell their story about how this is impacting them, right? There are more than 240 elementary schools named after Robert E. Lee. There are several elementary schools named after Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy. So all the time, Lee High School competes against Davis High School and Bedford High School and Beauregard High School. Hundreds of schools are named after these individuals. And again, the schools may be aesthetically beautiful. These monuments in Washington are aesthetically beautiful. But when we stop and interrogate the meaning of those memorials, we realize that we are being told a new story about the Civil War and the Confederacy. And that story was very intentional. And the aesthetics of these monuments are very intentional. You notice it's not simply building names or a rock on a corner. They thought, how can we convince a future generation that the Civil War was for Southern pride and good and honor, not about the continuation of slavery?
Yeah, because they're really drawing on, old historic, artistic devices, right? The
Yes.
guy on the horse and then, the scale of the memorials often is huge, right? So they're supposed to be looking up in awe. I mean, so it's interesting. They're really kind of using these kind of classic kind of ways of conveying messages about heroism and
Yes.
Dominance and, and so forth. They're very didactic in the end in terms of thinking about, kind of almost like indoctrinating us into
Yes.
this is how you're supposed to think about this person, right?
Yeah.
But on the other hand, these examples of the schools, where, I'm playing for Lee High School. I mean, the other thing that's kind of weird about that is how it kind of normalizes it, right? I mean, there's a sense in which it's just operating like beneath the level of consciousness where kids are just going around wearing lead t-shirts, maybe not even understanding like, who this guy is, right? And and the fact that they're maybe kind of almost endorsing something without meaning to, right? It's just so
Up,
complex, lots of
up
stuff.
until 1997, the University of Mississippi's football team, that's probably 70% African American kids, were running out onto the football field with a Confederate flag. And the band was playing Dixie, and the school mascot was a rebel.
It's so
So
jarring.
it is this kind of constant brainwashing that
Yeah.
you're
Mhm.
living in it and not realizing how offensive it is. Now,
Right.
and I'm not going to say zero people realize, some individuals did
Hmm.
realize this is wrong, but they were shouting into the dark. I think years and years of consciousness raising, students
Hmm.
waking
Hmm.
up, society waking up to issues of
Hmm.
privilege, issues of extremism. The January 6th insurrection of the Capitol, where the Confederate flag was marched through the Capitol, was not by accident. It was very intentional that that group wanted to
Hmm.
bring this
Hmm.
message, and these things have meaning. I often hear nobody worries about the name of the school, nobody worries about the flag or the shirt or the name of the building. It's not offensive, but it is a message that is intended to subjugate
Hmm.
people of color.
Hmm. So here's a question from one of my students, Grecia Sanchez. Dr. Carey, I love your work. Thank you for sharing it with us. I'm wondering what the process of the removal of memorials looks like for universities, at least the average response given your analysis. What should students who protest know about a systematic response from universities? And does such a thing even exist?
Yeah. So I'll talk a little bit about the composition of committees. The president, after the students' protests, sometimes take over the president's office, make demands, and
Mm,
those things became easier and easier after Charleston, after Breonna Taylor, after Ahmaud Arbery, after George Floyd, after those things. Universities started to say, we can't sit as if nothing is happening, and students had been protesting. So then the president says, okay, I will charge a task force. And this task force will be made up of the following members. The average task force has been about 12 members, 6 faculty, 4 staff, 2
two
students.
students.
All those students initiated were the catalyst. They are often the minority on the task force.
Mm,
Um, so one university, Bowling Green State University, had a task force that included 6 faculty and staff and 6 student members. At Bowling Green, their theater in their student union was named after Lillian Gish.
mm,
Lillian Gish was the star actress in the silent film The Birth of a Nation. If you know about The Birth of a Nation, it's a movie a 3-hour movie that attempts to depict the Reconstruction era after the Civil War. As a result of Reconstruction, men of color were able to vote and men of color were elected into office. And this movie shows how awful that was for the country. And then the Ku Klux Klan came to save the nation. So Lillian Gish was the star, and the students said, this is inappropriate.
mm,
So the university then took that recommendation from the task force. The president presents it to the board as a recommendation. The board deliberates whether they should remove it or not, and then the board comes back with a decision. As I mentioned, 22 of them were retained, about 25 of them were removed, 8 of them were relocated, and there's no typical response. Some schools are
okay.
state schools, some schools are private schools, some schools are in the former Confederate states, and they will fight to the bitter end to protect Confederate memorials on campus. So it's really what part of the country you're in.
Mm,
Not far from Western Michigan University, probably a little bit north and west, you have Allendale. Allendale, in their town square, has a group of memorials to American wars. And in there, there's a statue of a Confederate soldier, a Union soldier, and a Black child kneel down in between them, reaching for a newspaper that says, freedom for enslaved people. So in Allendale, the town council debated this vigorously in public, and they voted 5-2 to retain that Confederate statue. So again, I wish there were a pattern that said all Confederate statues were X or all segregationist statues were Y, but boy, it all depends on the university, the president, and the board.
And how those task forces are set up and what kind of guidelines are given, I imagine,
That's
because that's
right.
going to constrain what kind of recommendations they can make, right?
That's right. Even the president's charge, in some of the presidents gave 4 types of charge. One charge was, tell me if the name should be removed, yes or no. That's it. Don't give me a new name. Just tell me if it should be removed, yes or no. That's one charge. The second charge was the president said, you know what? We don't have principles for this decision. Come up with a list of principles, and then I'll decide how to apply the principles. Another charge from the president was, in addition to coming up with principles, I want the task force to apply those principles to a recommendation. And then a fourth type of charge, and these aren't in any particular order, is the president saying to the committee, tell us how to contextualize it, meaning the memorial is going to stay. That decision is already made. But we need you to help us design the plaque that's going to sit next to it to help the community feel better. One of the things in the Allendale case, I listened to some of the videos, and one of the people defending the memorial said, you know what, if people choose to be offended by these memorials, that's their choice. These memorials are not here to offend. So this is back to this kind of parentalism, saying people are making these choices on their own. That's not why these memorials are here. And it's connected to history. This goes all the way back in history, where they treat marginalized groups as children, and we are here as parents to tell you what to be offended by or not.
Thank you. So Glenda Ross, your colleague and also my colleague at Western, and as you said, instrumental. She brought your book to my attention, for which I'm very grateful. She says, your book highlights how universities handled issues of memorialization, but this issue has surfaced in sports and corporate spaces as well. Oops, I lost my space here. Sorry, hold on just a sec, because sometimes it's a little hard to read from the chat. Can you briefly talk about that and why it's important for other aspects of our society to grapple with memorials?
Yes. So for a long time, let's step off of campus for a minute. For a long time, the Confederate flag has been an instrumental part of NASCAR. Boy, you went to a NASCAR race in the South, and sure enough, there were tons of Confederate flags in the stands. All of you are familiar with the team that we all grew up knowing as the Washington Redskins. You're familiar with the Cleveland Indians. You may be familiar with the Kansas City Chiefs. You are likely familiar with Aunt Jemima syrup. You're familiar with Uncle Ben's rice. All of these brands and sports teams, after the death of George Floyd, went back and revisited all of their product branding. Aunt Jemima theoretically says, we're no longer going to make syrup in this bottle. We're going to remove the name Aunt Jemima. I was in the grocery store a week ago, and that syrup is still there. Uncle Ben, they said they were going to remove Uncle Ben from the rice. I haven't really seen that happen. So the Redskins are now the Commanders. I believe the Cleveland Indians are now the Cleveland Monuments. The Kansas City Chiefs remain. The Chicago Blackhawks remain. The Florida State Seminoles remain. San Diego State Aztecs remain. But within sports, within corporate brands, there is some attention to it. I'm slightly concerned that the moment may be waning and the major decisions may have been made, and they're saying, let's move on to the next story. War in Ukraine. Let's focus on that and what we're doing to support the war in Ukraine, what we're doing to support immigrants. Let's forget about this memorialization thing. Well, someone else, what happens is someone's life is taken, and then we start all over again. Many
Yeah.
of these things were propelled by the Black Lives Matter movement
Hmm.
after the
Hmm.
death of Trayvon Martin in
Hmm.
2013. They started. So it looks like it happened overnight, but it's been decades in the making. And there was
Hmm.
a prior generation to me, a prior generation to all of us, who brought these issues up in the 60s, but they didn't have enough political will and political clout. Um, CEOs of major companies weren't listening to black and brown consumers, so it didn't matter. When the
Hmm.
Confederate flag was flown in Georgia and South Carolina, Pepsi Cola said that they would boycott an upcoming Olympics. Eventually, the Confederate flag was removed from Georgia's state flag, but it remained in South Carolina. The NCAA protested and said, "We won't bring any national championships to the state of South Carolina." South Carolina said, "Okay, we'll remove the flag, but we'll put it on top of the State House dome." So you've seen over the past 2 or 3 decades incremental movement towards this moment, but I do believe product branding and sports teams is a major component. And after George Floyd, there were at least 30 cases of major changes in corporate America. My work, of course, focuses on universities, and you'll see a lot of companies hiring EDI experts right now. And
Hmm.
boy, that's a brutal job. You think it's tough on a university. I could only imagine what it looks like doing this work for Starbucks or Apple or
Hmm. Hmm.
Amazon or anyone else
Hmm.
with regard to issues of EDI. But branding, corporate branding has been important.
Hmm. Thank you. So, Carla Kresge, that's my dean, she says, I just returned from a trip to Charleston and my family was struck by the number of housing developments and subdivisions that were named something plantation.
Yes.
Same with roads. Once we started paying attention, we realized how omnipresent this was. Same with named roads, etc., after Confederate sites and soldiers. I don't know enough about our local history to know about problematic local historic names on roads um, and so forth here. Um, but yeah, would make a fantastic project for a student group to investigate, she says.
So that reminds me, let me tell you the story of Cornell University. On Cornell's campus, they had what's called Cornell Botanical Plantation. And students had been protesting for years to remove the name plantation from Cornell Botanical Plantation. And the archivists of the plantation or those who oversee said, yes, in 1944, we did name it Cornell Plantation in an effort to reclaim the word plantation and make it positive. It's a beautiful garden with a mixture of flowers, and we wanted to remove the stigma around the name plantation. That's why we know it's connected to enslaved labor, but we at Cornell in 1944, we decided we wanted to reclaim the word for the positiveness that it could be. That went over like a lead balloon in 2015 when students were protesting
Yeah.
and other things were happening around the world. They assembled a task force, examined it, and said, you know what? Students know what the library is, students know what the gym is, but students don't know what the plantation is. And the only connotation that most people associate with plantation is slavery. So, under their best efforts, they cannot recover the name plantation and make it anything more positive than what it is right now. So they changed it to Cornell Botanical Gardens.
Well, there you go.
So, and
I have to say, though, I find plantations an interesting example of this because in the South, where these places exist, they do book them for weddings and this and that, right? I mean, they in fact, right? I mean, and it kind of goes back to Ashley's question about aesthetics, right? So there's a sense in which these can be rather beautiful places in their own way, right? With a
yes,
beautiful garden. So and so they're like, well, we should take advantage. It's a beautiful spot. Of course, it's a great place for a wedding. And then people are going, really? Like, oh, really? I mean, it just seems like another one of those interesting examples
yeah,
where
but
it's so jarring, the
yeah,
juxtaposition.
You know, I don't know the term for this, but I'm sure someone knows the term for it. It's like when you're looking at the picture and it's two pictures in one, but you can only see one of the pic. You can see the picture of the old lady, but you can't see the picture of the beautiful girl. And then when you see the beautiful girl, you're like, oh my God, that was so obvious. I feel like we're having that moment now, that things that have existed for decades, we've all driven on a street. You know, there's a city in Florida
Sure.
called Plantation, that recently renamed itself, and their plantation is connected throughout the South, especially in South Carolina. And we've seen that for generations and decades and never questioned it. So
That's right.
suddenly we're seeing the beautiful girl or the ugly lady for the first time, and we're saying, "Wow, how long have we been doing this?" Right? And there's
Mhm.
so many streets named after Lee and Washington and Davis and all types of Confederate leaders that we drive by every day, and we're just waking up to the Washington Redskins.
That's
Like
right.
it's offensive letting it come out of my mouth right
That's
now,
right.
but
Yeah.
that's what we called them
Well,
for
yeah, that's right.
a long time.
So this goes back to consciousness raising, right? And
Yes.
I suppose I would say, maybe to my earlier point, that ethics can't just be about social convention or laws, right? That maybe there's something real underneath it all, but sometimes we just aren't aware of it and haven't
Yeah.
given it
Yeah.
enough thought, haven't, to use your word, grappled with it sufficiently, and so it's just passing us by.
Hmm.
So people are starting to pay attention. So that's great. So I think we've gotten to everybody's questions that I saw. Um, Ashley says gestalt is the word maybe that we're looking for.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
so yeah, yeah. So anyway, fabulous questions. Thank you so much, everybody. Is there anything you want to add before we close? Because I see we're at time.
Yeah, I want to say thank you for everyone who joined this important conversation. One of the things that I referenced that I haven't seen universities do is take the proactive step of saying, let's be thorough about our campus. Let's look. I think just opening this conversation with students and saying, hey, students, come share your concerns about our landscape. We are inviting students of all different ethnic backgrounds, cultures, indigenous students, yet we're not paying attention to the landscape as part of the EDI movement. So we know what equity looks like, we know what
Mhm.
diversity, we know what inclusion looks like, but then we ignore the landscape. And we're asking students to live in spaces, eat in spaces, learn in spaces, and some of them are struggling in silence. One of the things
Mhm.
I think is so important about landscape fairness is that universities, like cities that have gone through war, like what's going on in Ukraine right now, universities and cities are often wounded places. Students come to universities sometimes with a lot of pre-enrollment pain. They've been through sexual abuse. They have been racialized in a school. They have been segregated against. And then they come to the university and they are hoping that this is a safe space. However,
Mhm.
sometimes the university only continues the trauma. Issues of sexual assault happening on college campuses, equity, diversity, and inclusion issues, acts of racism happen in the classroom, faculty members doing daily microaggressions in the classroom that continue like a paper cut, cutting away at students. And it only continues the trauma. So we're often surprised by the number of students that are flooding the counseling center. What we are not doing is pausing and saying, let's examine the environment. I heard this great analogy once. You know, when the frogs are sick, we don't pull out the individual frogs and try to fix the individual frog. We interrogate the pond that they're in. Is the water clean? Is the water appropriate? What's going on with the water? So it's really about getting into the upstream work that my counseling colleagues will be very familiar with. We're pulling bodies out of the water, but we're not going back to the beginning of the stream to say, what's happening in our environment that's causing students to react like this? I would challenge some of it is about the landscape.
That's a wonderful way to close. Thank you so much. So appreciate you so much for being here tonight with us, Ainsley. Thank you. And thanks to all of you who are with us tonight and for the great questions. I hope to see you at a future Ethics Center event. As I said, we have a couple of special events coming up on April 12th, and I think Kara put some information in the chat for you. You can always see what we're up to at www.wmish.edu. www.edu/ethics. I hope you'll join us in the future for future events. So again, thank you so much, Ainsley.
Thank you.
I see lots of claps.
Thank you,
Really
Sandy.
appreciate you. Thank you. And thanks everybody. See you next time.